They didn't ask questions before calling the police. They didn't knock again. They didn't check paperwork. They dialed first, confident that uniforms would do what their words couldn't. I remember standing there, hands visible, calm on the outside, while inside my mind raced. The accusation was simple: trespassing. The assumption was simpler: I didn't belong. The officer arrived quickly. Lights off, posture neutral, eyes scanning the scene. The HOA representative stood nearby, arms crossed, faces tight with satisfaction. One of them said it clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's not part of this HOA." They said it like a verdict. Like the conversation was already over. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned long ago that the fastest way to lose control is to fight the wrong moment. I simply said, "I'm not in your HOA." That sentence landed differently than they expected. It wasn't denial. It was precision. That was when the smirks appeared. They explained to the officer that I had no authority to be there, that I was refusing to comply, that I'd been warned before. None of it was true, but it sounded confident. Confidence can be convincing when no one checks. The officer looked at me and asked for identification. I handed it over calmly. While he reviewed it, my mind drifted to the paperwork sitting quietly in my briefcase. Documents most people never read twice. Deeds. Transfers. Amendments signed months earlier and filed without fanfare. Paper that didn't shout, didn't threaten, but carried weight far heavier than voices. The HOA woman laughed softly and said, "This won't take long." She believed that. They all did. To them, the police call was the end of the story. A display of authority meant to close the loop and remind me of my place. The officer looked back up and asked a question no one expected. "Do you own this parcel?" I said yes. The air shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. I explained slowly, carefully, that while I wasn't part of their HOA, the land beneath several shared access points belonged to me. That a recent deed change had transferred ownership quietly, legally, and completely. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain more than necessary. The officer nodded and turned to them. The confidence drained from their faces as reality began to catch up. They had called the police to intimidate me. They hadn't realized they just called a witness to their mistake. The officer didn't react the way they expected. There was no sudden authority shift in their favor, no warning directed at me. Instead, he asked for clarification. Calmly. Professionally. That alone unsettled them. When power is borrowed, even a pause feels threatening. I opened my briefcase and handed over the documents. Not dramatically. Just paper, neatly organized, the way lawyers like things. The HOA representatives leaned in, trying to read upside down, their earlier confidence replaced with irritation. The officer stepped aside to review everything carefully, page by page. "This deed transfer is recent," he said finally. "Yes," I replied. "Filed and recorded." Silence followed. The kind that forces people to reconsider what they thought they knew. The HOA woman tried to recover quickly. She insisted that ownership didn't matter, that community rules still applied, that I was obligated to comply like everyone else. Her voice sounded rehearsed, not certain. That's when I explained the part they hadn't anticipated. I wasn't a resident refusing HOA rules. I was a landowner whose property intersected with their shared access. Boat ramps. Walkways. Utility easements. All the invisible pieces that keep a lake community functioning. Pieces they used every day without ever thinking about who owned them. The officer asked a few more questions. Direct ones. Legal ones. Questions that didn't bend around confidence or titles. When he finished, he handed my documents back and turned to them. "This is a civil matter," he said. "And based on what I'm seeing," he's not trespassing. Their reaction was immediate. Frustration. Disbelief. A quiet panic they tried to hide. The call they'd made to intimidate me had backfired completely. Instead of removing me, they'd confirmed something they didn't want acknowledged. As the officer left, he gave me a look that said everything. He'd seen this before. Power used carelessly. Assumptions replacing facts. People calling the police because they thought authority would automatically side with them. The HOA representative stayed behind, demanding explanations. I didn't give them much. I told them the truth, plainly. The deed change had shifted more than ownership. It had shifted leverage. And because they'd never bothered to check land records, they'd been operating on assumptions for years. One of them asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" I answered honestly. "You never asked." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a single confrontation. It was about a system built on intimidation instead of understanding. And systems like that don't react well when the balance quietly changes. They walked away angry, already planning their next move. They didn't know I was already 3 steps ahead. The next move came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, I received a formal notice from the HOA's legal counsel. It was written to sound authoritative, heavy with language about community standards, shared rules, and compliance expectations. What it carefully avoided mentioning was ownership. They talked around the issue, hoping confidence alone would pressure me into stepping back. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. I didn't respond immediately. Silence unsettles people who rely on escalation. Instead, I requested copies of the HOA's governing documents, amendments, and land use maps through public records. What I found explained everything. Years earlier, when the lake community was first developed, ownership lines were drawn differently than people assumed. Over time, properties were sold, parcels subdivided, and responsibilities blurred. The HOA kept enforcing rules, but no one updated the foundation beneath them. Land records told a different story than their rulebook. The deed change I'd completed months earlier wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Routine. A legal adjustment tied to an unrelated transaction. But it placed several critical access corridors under my ownership. Paths they depended on. Infrastructure they managed without realizing they didn't own. That oversight was about to matter. I sent a short response to their lawyer. No accusations. No emotion. Just attachments. Deed records. Parcel maps. A single sentence stating that any further attempts to restrict my access would require clarification of authority. Nothing more. The reply came the next day, noticeably less confident. They asked for time to review internal records. That phrase told me everything. They didn't have answers. They had habits. Meanwhile, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Not gossip, just facts. People talk when police are called and nothing happens. Neighbors started asking questions. Some were curious. Others concerned. A few admitted they'd always felt the HOA pushed boundaries, but no one had ever challenged them. At the next HOA meeting, I attended quietly. No confrontation. Just presence. When the issue came up, the board struggled. They talked in circles, avoided specifics, and promised updates. The room felt different. Less obedient. More attentive. Someone asked directly whether the HOA actually owned the land it regulated. No one answered. That silence mattered more than any argument. It exposed the gap between authority and legitimacy. People don't rebel instantly. They question first. And once questions start, control weakens. I left the meeting knowing something had shifted. The police call had failed. The legal pressure was stalling. And now, the community itself was paying attention. They'd tried intimidation. They discovered leverage instead. The shift became visible within days. Not loud, not confrontational, but unmistakable. The HOA stopped sending emails as frequently. Notices that once appeared instantly were delayed or rewritten. Confidence was replaced with caution, and caution spread faster than authority ever had. When power relies on intimidation, uncertainty is dangerous. I received another message from their attorney, this time requesting a meeting. The tone was polite, almost collaborative. They wanted to clarify boundaries and avoid misunderstandings. Translation was simple. They wanted to regain footing without admitting error. I agreed to meet, but only with conditions. Everything in writing. Everything documented. No private agreements. The meeting took place in a small conference room near the lake. 3 HOA representatives sat across from me, folders neatly arranged, expressions carefully neutral. They talked about cooperation, community harmony, and shared goals. I listened patiently. When they finished, I placed my documents on the table. Deeds. Maps. Recorded filings. I didn't lecture. I let the paper speak. One of them asked a question that revealed everything. Are you saying you control the neighborhood? No, I replied calmly. I'm saying you don't. That distinction mattered. Control isn't ownership of people. It's authority over systems. And their system rested on land they no longer understood. The room went quiet as the realization settled in. Outside that room, the community was changing too. Neighbors who had never questioned fines or warnings before were suddenly curious. They pulled property records. They compared notes. They noticed inconsistencies. The HOA's authority had depended on silence more than legality, and silence was gone. Then came the mistake that sealed everything. The HOA attempted to enforce a restriction on lake access without verifying ownership. That action triggered a formal complaint to the county. Not from me, but from another resident who had started asking questions after the police incident. The county responded quickly. Requests for proof. Requests for authority. Requests the HOA couldn't answer cleanly. Within a week, enforcement was suspended pending review. No fines. No restrictions. No threats. The announcement wasn't celebrated. It was absorbed. People didn't cheer. They exhaled. Fear had quietly stepped out of the room. Standing by the water that evening, I understood something clearly. This had never been about becoming powerful. It was about exposing borrowed authority. Once exposed, it collapses under its own weight. They called the police to intimidate me. They triggered an audit instead. With enforcement suspended, the lake community entered unfamiliar territory. There was no collapse, no chaos, just an uneasy quiet. For years, the HOA had been the final authority, the loudest voice in every dispute. Now that voice was gone, and people weren't sure what would replace it. Uncertainty doesn't always create panic. Sometimes it creates awareness. The board issued a brief statement calling the suspension temporary. They promised cooperation with the county and urged residents to remain calm. But the message lacked conviction. Without authority behind it, the words felt hollow. People had learned to read between the lines. Behind the scenes, the ignored deed change began to matter in ways no one had anticipated. Access points to the lake, utility corridors, and shared walkways all intersected with parcels I legally owned. Not dramatically. Not intentionally. Just as a consequence of how the land had been divided years earlier. The HOA had managed these areas by assumption, not ownership. My attorney explained it simply. You're not their ruler, he said. But you're unavoidable. That distinction shaped every decision I made next. I didn't restrict access. I didn't threaten control. I invited conversation. I called for an open meeting, not under HOA rules, but as neighbors. Voluntary. Transparent. No fines attached. The turnout surprised everyone. People asked thoughtful questions. About maintenance. About funding. About what authority actually meant. Without the threat of punishment, discussions felt calmer, more productive. Solutions replaced arguments. The former board members attended quietly, sitting among the crowd instead of above it. Their expressions told the story. Confusion. Regret. Relief. Power is heavy when you're responsible for it and exhausting when you're pretending to be. Over the following weeks, temporary committees formed to handle essential tasks. Lake safety. Landscaping. Repairs. Things didn't fall apart. They improved. When people understood the system, they participated instead of resisting it. The county issued another update. If the HOA failed to demonstrate lawful authority within a fixed deadline, permanent realignment would follow. No extensions. No exceptions. That deadline changed everything. The board scrambled to recover legitimacy, but trust doesn't reset on command. Years of intimidation had left scars. People remembered fines, warnings, and threats that now looked questionable. Once authority is questioned, it never fully recovers its old shape. Standing near the water one evening, I realized the truth. The police call had been meant to put me in my place. Instead, it had forced everyone to finally ask where that place really was. And the answer wasn't what anyone expected. As the county's deadline approached, the tension around the lake changed from uncertainty to pressure. The former HOA board no longer spoke with confidence. Their emails became careful, legalistic, filled with phrases meant to sound cooperative while revealing very little. Meetings were scheduled, cancelled, then rescheduled again. Every delay exposed how unprepared they were to defend authority they'd never properly secured. Their attorneys proposed a reset. New elections. Revised bylaws. Promises of transparency and compliance. On paper, it looked responsible. In reality, it missed the point entirely. The problem wasn't presentation. It was history. Authority doesn't reset because someone suddenly decides to follow the rules. It resets only if the rules allow it. And in this case, they didn't. I stayed deliberately quiet. That silence wasn't arrogance. It was restraint. Anything I said publicly could be framed as influence or intimidation, the very behavior that had caused this situation in the first place. The documents were doing their work. My voice wasn't needed. Meanwhile, the community adapted faster than anyone expected. Without a central board issuing commands, neighbors organized informally. Maintenance schedules were shared openly. Lake usage rules were discussed and agreed upon collectively. The absence of threats didn't create disorder. It created cooperation. One afternoon, a former board member stopped me near the dock. He didn't sound defensive or angry. Just tired. He admitted they never expected anyone to challenge them calmly and legally. We thought calling the police would end it, he said. We didn't think it would start this. That conversation stayed with me. Power built on intimidation always assumes compliance. It never plans for scrutiny. When the deadline finally arrived, the county's determination came swiftly. The HOA had failed to demonstrate lawful authority within the required time frame. The land-based governance structure outlined in the original development agreement was triggered permanently. Control over shared access, enforcement, and oversight shifted exactly as written decades earlier. The announcement didn't cause celebration. It caused relief. No shouting. No victory speeches. Just a collective pause as people absorbed the fact that uncertainty finally had an ending. Messages came in quietly. Thank yous. Questions. Reflections. I answered when necessary and stayed out of the spotlight when I wasn't. This had never been about replacing one authority with another. It was about correcting a system that had drifted too far from accountability. That evening, as the sun lowered over the lake, everything looked the same. The houses, the docks, the water. But the atmosphere felt lighter, as if a weight no one had named was finally gone. They had called the police to assert control. They had lost it instead. Life around the lake began to settle into something quieter and more balanced. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Without constant warnings and fines hanging over people's heads, neighbors started talking directly to each other. Small issues were handled with conversations instead of citations. For the first time in years, the community felt like a place to live, not a system to survive. A temporary governance framework emerged naturally. Volunteers stepped forward, not because they wanted power, but because they wanted stability. Roles rotated. Decisions were written down and shared openly. Budgets were discussed in plain language instead of buried in emails no one read. Transparency didn't slow progress the way critics had predicted. It actually made things easier. The former HOA board attempted one last appeal. They argued that property values would suffer without strict enforcement and centralized authority. The county reviewed their claim carefully and rejected it. The ruling was simple and final. Authority lost through intimidation and neglect cannot be reclaimed through fear. Once trust is broken, it doesn't return on demand. What surprised many residents was how quickly confidence returned. Buyers didn't disappear. Realtors didn't panic. If anything, interest increased. People liked knowing exactly how decisions were made and who was responsible. A community governed by clarity felt safer than one ruled by threats. I stayed intentionally in the background. I declined leadership positions and avoided becoming the center of attention. The deed change hadn't made me a ruler. It had made me unavoidable for a moment, and that moment had passed. My role was never to replace the HOA. It was to expose a flaw that needed correcting. One evening, as I walked along the shoreline, I passed homes with lights glowing warmly through open windows. Laughter drifted across the water. The lake looked the same, but the atmosphere felt different. Lighter. More human. That's when I understood something important. Control hadn't transferred to a new authority. It had been redistributed. A neighbor asked me if I regretted not simply paying the fine and moving on. I thought about it carefully before answering. Paying would have been easier. Quieter. Safer. But it would have confirmed a dangerous idea. That authority can misuse power and expect silence in return. Rules only matter when someone is willing to test them calmly and legally. The police call that started everything hadn't been personal. It was institutional. It came from years of unchecked confidence and the belief that intimidation would always work. That belief didn't survive scrutiny. Power doesn't disappear when it's questioned. It reshapes itself. And when it reshapes correctly, communities breathe easier. Accountability doesn't destroy systems. It strengthens them. All of this began because someone tried to scare me into compliance and assumed I would step back. Instead, I stepped into the truth. Months passed, and what once felt unstable slowly became routine. Not because rules were stricter, but because they were finally understood. The lake community adjusted in quiet, practical ways. Schedules were posted openly. Responsibilities were shared. Disagreements still happened, but they were resolved through discussion instead of enforcement. Fear had been replaced by familiarity. The old HOA structure officially dissolved after the final county filings were completed. There was no dramatic announcement, no emotional letter explaining the change. Just an update in public records. An organization that once felt untouchable ended the same way it had governed, through paperwork few people had ever bothered to read. I observed everything from a distance. Committees rotated leadership every few months. No one stayed in charge long enough to grow comfortable. Budgets were reviewed openly, line by line. Maintenance improved because people knew exactly where the money went. Transparency didn't slow decisions. It removed suspicion, and suspicion had always been the real obstacle. New residents moved in and asked about the HOA. The answer was always calm and simple. We don't operate like that anymore. When they asked why, the explanation stayed factual. A police call. A deed change. A review that revealed more than anyone expected. No one exaggerated. The truth was enough. What surprised me most was how quickly the culture changed. Without the threat of sudden penalties, people took more responsibility, not less. They respected shared spaces because they felt ownership, not fear. That shift altered everything from how meetings were run to how neighbors spoke to each other. I kept the original police incident report and the deed paperwork together in a folder. Not as trophies, but as reminders. Power doesn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it hides in routine, in confidence, in the assumption that no one will check. The moment someone does, everything changes. One afternoon, I crossed paths with a former HOA board member near the lake. He nodded politely, no resentment in his expression. He admitted the experience had changed how he thought about authority. We confused control with responsibility, he said. That mistake caught up with us. That sentence stayed with me. The lake looked peaceful that evening. The water reflected the sky without interruption. Boats moved slowly, unhurried. Children played near the shore. Nothing in the scene suggested conflict or control. And that was the point. Good governance disappears into the background. Bad governance demands attention. Looking back, this was never about becoming powerful. It was about restoring balance where intimidation had replaced accountability. The deed change didn't create chaos. It corrected a quiet imbalance that had gone unchecked for years. A police call meant to scare me had done the opposite. It had exposed a system that could no longer hide behind confidence alone. In the end, nothing about the lake looked unusual to someone passing through. The water still shimmered in the afternoon light. The docks stretched out quietly. The houses reflected the same sunsets they always had. But for those of us who lived there, the change was permanent, settled deep beneath the surface. The story spread slowly beyond our community. Not as gossip, but as a lesson. Realtors mentioned it carefully. Attorneys referenced it during consultations. Nearby HOAs began reviewing their own documents, suddenly aware that confidence without compliance is fragile. Authority invites scrutiny the moment someone decides not to look away. People often ask me what the deed change actually said. I never quoted it word for word. The exact language mattered less than the truth behind it. Rules are not decorations. They are not suggestions. They are agreements. And agreements don't care about tone, tradition, or intimidation. They care about whether they are followed. I thought about that often in the evenings, sitting by the lake as the light faded. How easy it would have been to back down when the police arrived. How tempting it would have been to explain less, to comply quietly, to avoid attention. That choice would have preserved comfort, but it would have rewarded misuse of power. Silence always does. The former HOA never recovered its authority, but the community gained something more valuable. Awareness. People learned that participation matters. That oversight matters. That leadership is temporary, but accountability is not. Those lessons outlived any board, document, or filing. Eventually, I sold the property. Not out of bitterness or triumph, but completion. When I handed over the keys, I also handed over a binder containing the land records, amendments, and filings. The new owner deserved clarity, not mystery. Transparency should be inherited, not rediscovered through conflict. As I drove away for the last time, I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. The story had never been about winning. It had been about correcting something quietly broken before it harmed more people. Systems rarely fail because they're challenged. They fail because they're never questioned. Routine becomes armor. Confidence becomes arrogance. And then one ordinary moment cracks everything open. A police call meant to intimidate me became the turning point. A deed change most people would have ignored became the fulcrum. The outcome wasn't chaos or revenge. It was recalibration. A reminder that authority borrowed from rules must obey them fully or give way. I still keep the paperwork. Not as proof of power, but as proof of something simpler. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need force to change outcomes. You need patience, precision, and the courage to read what others ignore. They called the police expecting fear. They uncovered the truth instead. And once truth enters a system built on intimidation, nothing ever goes back to the way it was.